Hi, Britlit students. So this week we are moving on to other authors from the 20th century. So our first author that we're looking at this week is William Butler Yeats. He is an Irish author from the early part of the 20th century. So a lot of his writing was done late 1800s, but mostly early 1900s. So during kind of the same time that the World War I poets were writing, but Yeats is not writing about World War I. His poetry is about other things, particularly Irish things. It is during this time period in the early part of the 20th century that the Irish Republic, which is the southern part of Ireland, eventually won their independence from England. And so they're not part of the United Kingdom or Great Britain anymore. And Yeats was alive and well during this final rebellion, the big rebellion of 1916, that eventually leads to Irish independence. For the southern part of Ireland, there's still northern part of Ireland that belongs to England. And Yeats writes in some interesting ways about nature, about relationship, and particularly about Ireland. The other 20th century author we're going to look at is W.H. Auden. He writes in more in the middle of the 20th century, some from about the 1930s to the 1960s. So he's going to carry us up to the 60s, which is when we'll then look at the Beatles. The Beatles start in the 60s. So it's an interesting shift there. Auden is very much a 20th century writer. So some key themes to keep in mind for 20th century. Everything that was comfortable, everything that was believed, everything that was considered truth during the Victorian era has been blown out of the water, right? We talked about that with World War I. So that means the authors and the thinkers and poets and artists of the 20th century are moving into what we now call modernism. And modernism is this way of writing or way of doing art that is, it wrestles with some pretty dark things, with isolation, which I think we all can kind of understand at this point, with fractures of society and fractured relationships. It deals a lot with personal relationship. And it wrestles with the idea of how can we ever truly know another person? How can we ever truly know ourselves? And how can we ever truly know truth? You know, those things that had seemed so acceptable and so normal have been torn apart. And so the writers and artists of the early and mid 20th centuries, especially in those periods, they're really looking at these big kind of existential questions about, well, how can we really know this? And so you see some of that wrestling in the poetry of Auden and in the poetry of Yeats. And so use that as a lens as you're reading their poetry this week. Really think about how are they asking big questions about society, about themselves, about relationship. And there's some, I think, unique ways that both of these poets are approaching those kinds of questions. Auden was a great admirer of Yeats. He, in fact, wrote a poem for Yeats upon Yeats's death. So there's an interesting connection between them. They weren't obviously alive. Their lives didn't overlap a great deal, but there is a certain brotherhood, I think, between them. So that's why I've paired them together. So this week, 20th century, you've got a PowerPoint presentation below with a lecture that kind of goes into some of those big ideas that I just sort of touched on just now. And then you've got the poetry of Yeats and Auden for Wednesday's class, and just a short little post/assignment to do that day. Nothing enormous at all. And then next week we move into some short stories, something we haven't read yet. So yeah, have a good week. Welcome to the 20th century and to 20th century authors. And I look forward to hearing from you. And if you need anything, let me know.